on the line with respect to accomplishing or attempting even. So that's something that you need to be mindful of. Asset protection strategies have their limits. They're not intended to protect you from tax obligations, though in some cases they may help you reduce them. But if you're coming forward for that sole purpose, you should probably turn your attention elsewhere. Additionally, it's not intended to assist you in fraudulently escaping legitimate existing debtors, or even debtors that you might legitimately expect to acquire in the future. So, with those caveats having been made, what is asset protection planning good for? Well, you may think after I've just said what I just said, what good is it? Maybe I've lost your interest. But the reality is, it's very good for a lot of people out there. Now let's talk about the average person who's going about their life. Certainly in America, and I would argue anywhere in the world, but certainly in America. What are the threats that they live with on a daily basis? They live with a threat from litigation, from lawsuits. I mean, America is clearly the worst economy, the worst business environment in the world for carrying on business as it pertains to potential tort litigation and other litigation. So much so that, quite frankly, it's become a problem that has been discussed on national and state levels as how they can attract businesses to invest in America given the threat that accompanies being in this jurisdiction. So we all live with that, but particularly those of us who are professionals, those who own small businesses, even people who are senior employees in organizations now are subject to potential personal liability as to various torts. Torts relating to discrimination, torts relating to harassment, various other federal, state, and some state statutes can actually permit filing of actions against individuals, though they're employees of corporations or larger organizations. So these threats, to some extent, touch us all, but they're particularly menacing to professionals and business owners. In many of these, I know some of you are listening to me now, you're aware of this. I don't have to tell you about these threats. Maybe some of you have been sued already. There are some threats that are difficult to insure against. Employee-related litigation, litigation for some types of discrimination, whether it's age, gender, religion, handicap, other things. I mean, some things you can be entirely innocent of any wrongdoing, and because of how your particular jurisdiction is in terms of jury selection, jury pools, state statutes, in other words, the judicial environment and the legal system in which you practice, you can be very prone to obligations in this area when you may in fact not be guilty. And I don't have to tell you this. Many of you know this already. What about other threats? Well, there's outside the workplace and business-related threats. There are threats from third parties you haven't met yet. When you drive your car, you live with a certain amount of threat. When you own land, you own real estate, you live with a certain amount of threat. Anytime you go about your day-to-day living in America, there are threats. Some you can anticipate and some you can't. What about creditors that come from other directions? Maybe creditors that you inherit. What if you have children who are driving automobiles, or children that incur debts, and perhaps you have either co-signed or you're considered an obligor under state law for some other reason? Debts also with respect to spouses. Now, this is an area that we deal with regularly as divorce lawyers, and in most states you can be held responsible for debts that your spouse incurs, with or without your permission. So the reality is it's a very perilous world, and there are a number of directions from which your wealth can be threatened. Now, let's talk a little bit about what the tools are of asset protection planning. We've covered what asset protection planning is in a general sense. We've talked about what it is not. And now let's talk about, what are some of the tools that might have relevance for you from the threats that you might face on a regular basis? I'll go over some of those. And remember, the purpose of this show is to kind of give you an introduction to asset protection planning, and then in the future we'll be able to break down different components of this discussion and cover those as well. But let's talk a few minutes about the tools. One tool can relate to simple contracts. A contract could be a prenuptial agreement. It could be a postnuptial agreement. It can be a contract between yourself and other business associates where there might otherwise be a predisposition to litigation or for disagreements. You can control risk to some extent simply through having good contractual relationships from those with whom you deal that might pose the most threat to your net assets. So contracts can be very useful, particularly in the domestic relations area. And there's a lot more to be said about this, and I'll dedicate easily a show, maybe several shows, to that discussion in the future. Another tool that's available, a tool that's gotten a lot of attention in recent years, and that's trusts. Trusts can come in a variety of different forms. There are onshore trusts, there are offshore trusts, which mean trusts that are placed in foreign jurisdictions. There are revocable trusts, there are irrevocable trusts. Trusts are a very powerful tool in asset protection planning. And to some extent, the way you would structure a trust is going to be dictated by the particular threats you have and the amount of aggressiveness, I would say, that you want to pursue asset protection. Some people are uncomfortable with offshore trusts. Some people are uncomfortable with trusts that are irrevocable, meaning you can't revoke it once you transfer the assets. And that means, though, that you're stuck with a revocable trust, which is domestic, meaning within the United States. And that has a lot of limitations. We'll talk about it more, but I'll tell you that, generally speaking, revocable trusts are not the centerpiece of asset protection planning. They'll be helpful to some of you, depending on your jurisdiction, but as a general rule, asset protection planning, as it pertains to trusts, generally refers to irrevocable trusts. Now, within the sphere of irrevocable trusts, there can be onshore and there can be offshore. And offshore trusts have gained a certain allure in recent years. They're a little bit of a step into the unknown, though not to a great extent. Some lawyers are uncomfortable with them. They feel that ultimately they might be thwarted by courts in the United States, and we'll talk about that more. Many very authoritative lawyers say no, that they're very safe. And right now it's a relatively unsettled area of the law because there's not been any litigation where you've had an offshore trust that's been created and created properly according to the rules of the way this should be done. It's been irrevocable, all the I's are dotted, T's are crossed, in which a domestic court has managed to penetrate or obtain the assets from that trust. The reason offshore trusts are attractive, and I would argue effective if properly created, is that the offshore trusts are created in jurisdictions where they do not acknowledge any international treaties or comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, or comity with other countries. And as a result, in these jurisdictions, they're entirely uninterested about what a court in the United States does. I mean, there's a large yawn in these jurisdictions when even a federal judge in the United States issues a proclamation. They simply do not give recognition to those court rulings in the United States. There are a number of jurisdictions that are very attractive. There's the Isle of Man. You've probably heard of that. You've heard of Cook Islands. Cook Islands is not far from New Zealand, middle of nowhere. But it's a place that has a long history of having a stable government, a stable economy, a stable legal system, one that has withstood the claims of the courts of various countries. So the Cook Islands has very carefully developed its reputation as a haven for people who have asset protection concerns. And so it's in this country's interest to assure that they protect their reputation in this way. There are trust companies there that are reputable, and they have relationships with institutions in the United States and around the world. So this is not, I don't want to give you the impression that this is some sort of jungle environment in which you're transferring your assets to a primitive economy. That's not the situation. When you use these offshore jurisdictions, the ones that are preferred, they're very sophisticated, and in many ways more sophisticated and more international than many of the institutions you deal with in the United States. Nevis is an island that's popular. Some have used the Bahamas. There's various Caribbean countries additionally who have tried to pursue the asset protection business. So these are there's an economy of sorts, an industry that has developed around this, and a number of many of them are islands, but a number of countries have decided that they're going to pursue this asset protection business. They realize this is a big thing. People in America have problems and they're looking for solutions. But it does, I'll have to tell you, there's a significant amount of cost associated with creating an offshore trust. There are some formalities that you have to abide by.